Jami-Lee Ross.
Mr Speaker, I stand along with my colleagues in rising to oppose this bill. I heard a comment from Mr Prosser who used the word anathema. Well, Mr Speaker, I actually think this is a bit of a constitutional anathema. We don't use the 75% provisions in this parliament for partisan issues like this. We typically use the entrenchment provisions around entrenching and ensuring that there is a greater level of support around the House for ensuring something is not able to be played around with during a political process for things like the Electoral Act. We have entrenchment provisions in the Electoral Act so that a party can't come in by a bare majority and can completely change the electoral system in New Zealand. It's a good reason why you would have the 75% provision inserted into legislation. But, Mr Speaker, when it comes to something like an asset owned by the government, actually not directly owned by the government, owned through a company, and then owned by the government, Mr Speaker, that is not a good reason why we should be inserting a provision requiring 75% of this House to vote if that asset was ever to be sold. There's no plans by the government to sell Kiwibank. There's no plans by the government to look at floating shares through Kiwibank. But, Mr Speaker, that is not a reason why this House should legislate to put in place such a high bar around that. I see that this issue is a bit of a knee-jerk reaction around the Future Investment Fund and the floating of energy companies that the government had that did several years ago. Mr Speaker, let's just remind ourselves that that took place after the government went to the public and asked the public whether or not they supported that policy through an electoral system. The government put that on the table and people voted for the government through a general election, knowing very well that that was going to happen. Mr Speaker, to then come into this House several years later and say that because the government went and did that we should put in place such a high bar around one particular company that the government has ownership in through several other companies, Mr Speaker, I can't see why we would need to do that. And, Mr Speaker, I note that there are parties in this parliament that are voting against this, that are voting for this bill and putting in place such a restriction around Kiwibank. I notice the New Zealand First Party is wanting to put in place this restriction around Kiwibank. I find that quite interesting because it wasn't that long ago, actually, Mr Speaker, not that long ago in the political life of Winston Peters, that he actually wanted to float shares in Kiwibank himself. Mr Speaker, in an interview with Guy Onespina in June 2011, Mr Speaker, Winston Peters actually talked about his previous plans for floating Kiwibank. He was asked by Guy Onespina in 2008, in 2008 you proposed floating shares in Kiwibank. Is that still your policy? Well, he bluffed and blustered around it as Winston did, but what he said was, if you want to expand
point of order taken, Cosgrove.
Mr Speaker, the member has misled the House. I don't think you ever promoted that, sir, in any capacity you have.
And possibly unlike the member, I did listen to the fact that the member was quoting. Jami-Lee Ross.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Let me just start again. He was asked by Guy Onespina around floating shares in Kiwibank, a previous policy of his, and he said, if you want to expand Kiwibank, it didn't have the money, and so you were taking, say, from 1 billion to 1.5 billion, floating the second 500 amount. Then he was interrupted by Guy Onespina. Guy does that from time to time, Mr Speaker. But the fact of the matter is, Winston Peters previously had a policy of floating shares in Kiwibank. A policy that Winston Peters and New Zealand First went to the public on because they felt that was an important option for Kiwibank to have. Having a provision like this put into legislation, Mr Speaker, would stop Winston Peters from being able to float shares in Kiwibank should he ever want to do that again in the future. So, Mr Speaker, I think that the New Zealand First Party should probably reconsider their position given the previous pedigree that Winston Peters has. Winston Peters also, Mr Speaker, has some pedigree around selling airports. And airports are important assets, just as banks are important assets. I say to New Zealand First and other parties in this parliament, when the New Zealand government sold off Auckland Airport, did 75% of this parliament vote on that? No. Was there a majority of people through a referendum voting on that? No. I think we need some consistency on issues like this. Mr. Speaker, the government entered into a process of floating shares in selling shares in some companies that we went to the public on in a general election and asked their permission to do that. There's been a great investment into areas like education, ultra-fast broadband and Kiwibank. Because of that, there are no plans to get involved in doing that with KiwiSaver. But Mr. Speaker, there shouldn't with Kiwibank. But Mr. Speaker, there shouldn't be such a high bar, such a high threshold put in place. We should only use that for important provisions, important legislation like the Electoral Act, where you shouldn't have a small majority in Parliament overturning an Electoral Act. It should be left for important issues like that.